difference does it make if it's intentional or accidental? He might accidentally knock Devin's head off. Is that what you're saying? Intentionally try to land it or accidentally try to land it. If it lands, it lands. If it puts him out, who cares? No one's going to ask whether that punch was set up or not. We know he's going to get knocked the f out for it.
Devin Haney possesses one of the best close stance jabs in the sport, which he will likely use to tattoo Brian Norman and control the fight. Off the rip, it's fast and incredibly accurate once he gets his timing down. After throwing it, he displays great defensive responsibility in preemptively pulling, ducking, and/or smothering into a clinch to take away countering opportunities. What turns his great jab into an elite lead hand is his ability to use feints and probes to control distance and disguise the jab's timing while varying its targets between the body and head, making it that much more difficult to counter or defend against. He uses foot feints, pre-slips, and level changes, all which serve the purpose of drawing out reactions, freezing his opponents, or masking the jab. Brian Norman's guards are the main source of his jab woes. The conventional guard is a reactionary defense, normally relying upon head movement, blocks, and parries to deal with oncoming offense. With Norman, he prefers to forego the blocks and parries and use head movement nearly entirely. So for jabs, we see slips and mostly pulls. The issue is Brian either isn't athletic enough to pull it off, but just flat out can't consistently time jabs. He mostly still gets hit anyway attempting to pull out of range of the jab or slip. Given the reactionary nature of his guard, feints, specifically Devin's pre-slips, can also draw out Norman's slips and preemptively put him out of position, making it even harder to time the jab. Or he just won't react to the pre-slip at all, which could allow Devin to land his jab regardless. He also attempts to parry out of the active high guard, but again isn't usually quick enough to actually do so and just ends up getting hit regardless. It should go without saying that if Norman can't find a way to deal with Haney's jab, he'll have a very long night.
Now, while I think that for the most part, Devin does possess an elite jab, it clearly possesses some technical issues that we're going to get into very shortly that he's paid for. And because of those consequences, Devin seemed a lot more tentative when throwing the jab in his last fight against Ramirez. It was far less active, and not to mention far less accurate, which is one of its strongest aspects. So without possessing the same confidence, let alone frequency, he had when throwing the jab in the past, I don't see a path to victory that doesn't involve him either meeting the canvas or getting outworked to a decision loss. And without being personally involved in the camp, it's impossible to know or ensure that Devin will throw the jab how he used to or how he recently did. So sure, if Devin's jab is on point, it could potentially cause Norman some fits. But is it? Will it be? I don't know. And neither do you, Jake. It's an intangible that may very well decide his performance.
Well, Joey, the problem with that entire argument is that I can reverse it back on you. You see, when a fighter has X amount of fights, and we see in those X amount of fights that this is a fighter that uses that lead hand proficiently, they jab proficiently, it sounds like you're more assured that he won't be using his lead hand the way we've seen in the past. It was one fight. Like you said, we're not in the camp. We don't know what the game plan was for that specific fight. So I just think that while we have a fighter that has done the same thing for 32 fights, to assume that since he did something different his last fight, that he's going to be that fighter, when he did what Devin does the best for most of his career, he's not going to change. I feel like that point is a little moot.
Brian Norman will likely be able to disturb Haney's timing through the use of feints. Norman utilizes a myriad of feints at his disposal, such as jab feints, rear hand feints, level changes, pre-slips, and foot feints. He uses this to get his opponents to move their hands out of position or offset their rhythm and timing, making them either strike preemptively or freeze up, leaving a momentary opening for him to counter. Haney typically approaches feints using one of two methods: disengaging with a full step back or attacking them as they're feinting. However, he's also been a victim of freezing in place or having his hands feinted out of position when trying to duck or down parry with the rear hand from mid-range without a step back, leaving his chin exposed to lead hooks, a mistake he's brutally paid for in the past.
So I technically rebut this in my first point. Norman feints for a number of reasons, but as you already mentioned, Haney may disengage for a number of those feints, which disarms them. You mentioned Haney attacks feints, which could work for Norman, drawing out offense to counter, but you showed clips of Haney for the most part attacking with combinations, which could run Norman into trouble if he's expecting single shots. Even the single shots that Haney threw in your own clips weren't without some form of responsibility. For example, the first clip you show, Haney level changes and gets a reaction from Ramirez, then shoots the hook and bounces out. The second single hook he throws off another level change, then smothers and angles out. So counterpunching if Haney attacks his feints is going to be tough for Norman. Also note that you only have one clip of Norman taking advantage of a rear hand dropping with a hook. So are you certain that he can do that in the fight?
Now, while I did state that Haney attacks feints, it's evidently clear in the film that what I use mostly pertains to level changes or pre-slips. Now, while Norman does utilize those, he just as often uses jabs and foot feints. Those are typically the feints that freeze or drop Devin's hands that expose him to Norman's explosive offense. Even if Devin doesn't drop his hand, he'll likely disengage, which will only bring him closer towards the ropes, limiting his movement, which can open him up to other issues that we're going to get into later.
Haney's offensive toolbox when he gets comfortable will likely disrupt Norman's timing and run him into offense. Once Devin is able to establish his jab, he lets his offense go behind it with a full punch arsenal. After establishing offense behind his jab and feint game, he begins to mix offense without feints in, using the inherent threat of the jab to keep his opponent's hands holstered. Norman uses pre-slips, level changes of his own. These serve the same purpose as Haney's, but are also used very often to bait and counter if his opponent commits while he's in these positions. To begin with, Haney's feints will likely make it difficult for Norman to time and counter him. Since Norman likes to counter single shots, but his tell is he'll use his head movement to bait, he can be set up if the op throws more than one punch. So here comes Haney's combination punching.
I can't help but point out that the clips of Haney opening up his offensive bag were anywhere between 3 to 6 years ago. I mean, are we serious? We're showing clips of him opening up against old-ass Gamboa and Linares? Man, give me a break. Those fighters weren't viewed as the same physical threat as Norman was for Haney to feel confident enough to open up and let his hands go, especially at that time. Where were these combinations against Ryan Garcia, a real power puncher who checked Haney when he tried to bite off more than he could chew? Were those combinations in his last fight against Ramirez? Did he forget how to throw them? The same could be said about Devin's combination punching against Kambosos. It's Kambosos. He's not a puncher. Norman is, and Haney's well aware of that. I think it's far-fetched to assume that Haney's gonna bring out an offensive bag that he's really shown against fighters that weren't young, explosive athletes with devastating punching power.
I'm gonna keep it simple for you, bro. You just said that where were those combinations against Ramirez? Just about 5 seconds ago, we just talked about Haney throwing combinations against Ramirez. What are you talking about? You talk about why weren't they there against Ryan? We're talking about using combinations against a dude that's feinting. Ryan isn't a heavy feinter. So that doesn't refute my point. I think you need to pay attention a little better, my guy.
Norman will likely counter Haney's tendency to throw single mid-range jabs. He often has great success countering the jab through the use of parry counters, simultaneous counters, and most frequently, slip counters. Other times, he'll eat the jab and still push through to land his power punch. Devin often adds a step forward when throwing those single mid-range jabs. Without a follow-up jab, power punch, or any type of defensive maneuver, you're essentially admiring your work while in danger by throwing the weakest punch while being in range, giving your opponent an opportunity to potentially counter with their strongest power punch. He exacerbates this issue by falling in when throwing the jab as well. This follows the same concept as stepping in with the jab, with the added risk of leaping into the momentum of the punch, multiplying the impact of the potential counter coming from the opposite direction. Haney tends to jab flat-footed, which usually leads to his body's momentum carrying in the direction that the foot is pointing, and in turn makes the rear leg swing into a cross step, in which Haney must step again to re-establish his base. This keeps him stuck on the lead foot longer, and he's vulnerable afterward until he steps back into stance. Norman will likely use the same counters when attacking Haney's tendency to throw bow and arrow jabs as well. The bow and arrow jab occurs when he pulls his rear hand away from his chin when he rotates the punch. This is by far Haney's most consistent issue when throwing his jab. As a result, he's been on the receiving end of quite a few simultaneous counters, most notably the lead left hook when in the motion of throwing the jab. This issue is just as apparent when he stabs the body. What's more is that when throwing stab jabs to the body, he often steps in wide, forcing him to recover balance on the lead foot to transfer weight to the rear foot while frequently dropping his lead hand near his waist. For those out there wondering if these jab issues were still present in his last fight, I'm afraid so.
If you took a moment to look at the clips that you presented, you realize that there's a big issue with the point you're trying to make. Devin is, for the most part, very responsible after throwing the jab, ducking and smothering, pulling, stepping out, etc. It's why in your clips, it's hard to find his opponents landing clean. The amount of feints Haney uses also adds to that problem because it makes it incredibly difficult to time that jab. Brian Norman Sr. definitely doesn't seem to acknowledge these feints. He was in the comment section talking about you don't got to feint when you too tall. That's the guy making the plan for your fighter. You mentioned Norman eats the jab, the counter. That's laughable, my guy. What are we doing here? What should we call that? The get hit and shoot? The face block and shoot? Get a grip. You're just showing the audience how much of an issue Norman will have dealing with the jab if he's already resorting to face blocking for opponents with much less technically sound jabs than Devin Haney's. You defeat yourself at this point. Now, in terms of the bow and arrow, I'm going to introduce you to a concept I call intentional versus incidental. If you look at the clips you presented, once again, you're not very good at that. How many of those of Norman supposedly taking advantage of the bow and arrow are lead hooks? I mean, Norman has a pretty good left hook. The opening is there, but where is it? I see a lot of jabs, not a lot of hooks. So I have to ask, is he intentionally taking advantage of the bow and arrow, or is Norman incidentally landing jab counters where his op just so happens to be throwing a bow and arrow? We know the hook is open, yet he doesn't throw it. Can you even truly argue that in these clips, Norman can identify the bow and arrow? If he could, he'd have attacked it at least once. Even in the only clip that you show that comes near close to it, the lead hook only lands because Quentin Randall is ducking and backing straight out. So that shit is whack. On that note, there's a reason why clips of Haney getting clocked with lead hooks throwing bow and arrows are rather sparse. They almost have to be simultaneous counters, which the one clip you showed certainly wasn't. This is again due to Haney's defensive responsibility after throwing the punch, which makes landing that hook very difficult. And again, the feints make getting the timing down a hard feat. A lot of people ignore that Ryan's left hook that hurt Dev wasn't some random punch, and it damn sure wasn't so rudimentary as eat and shoot boy here. It was set up. Ryan probed Haney's rear hand and closed off that lane, which made it much more likely that Devin jabbed on Ryan's timing, meaning that he could throw that lead hook to precise and catch dude. It goes without saying, but I haven't noticed Brian using this concept. If he did, you surely would have said it. I mean, I have to ask this question. Are you intentionally throwing this debate, or are you incidentally not able to make a very good case for Brian Norman Jr.?
While you did bring up Devin's elite jab and his defensive responsibility after throwing said punch, the biggest issue he has is during the punch itself, exposing his chin as Ryan so brutally checked in their fight and buckled the hell out of Devin's legs in the very first round. I'm sure Devin threw plenty of feints before throwing the first committal jab. That didn't change the fact that his hand was away from his face, leaving him a sitting duck for Ryan's counter lead hook. He only punched the dude is known for, and he still got caught with it. So what does that say about Devin's defensive responsibility? He should have kept his hand there, but he didn't. And he still doesn't. That's proved by the Ramirez fight. It hasn't changed. One more training camp isn't going to drill that shit out of him. And if he gets stuck on the front foot when throwing it and it can only duck, all Norman has to do is change the trajectory of his punch and follow Haney as he comes down. Even if he stabs the body, he'll be at the mercy of Norman's parry counters. So even if he starts letting that jab go, one good shot from Norman might kill that nose and revert him back to the tentative Devin Haney who was circling the ring all day against Ramirez. And I'm going to get into why that shit ain't going to work soon enough either. But you were talking about how intentional or accidental. What difference does it make if it's intentional or accidental? He might accidentally knock Devin's head off. Is that what you're saying? Who cares if it intentionally try to land it or accidentally try to land it? If it lands, it lands. If it puts him out, who cares? No one's going to ask whether that punch was set up or not. No one cares if Ryan set it up or not. You're talking about how he could set it up. You're talking about how it's sparse, but it happened. So we know it's available. We know that it could be a problem for Devin. That's why he's working on this to begin with. Because if he doesn't, we know he's going to get knocked the fuck out for it. If not this fight, then the next.
Haney will likely time Norman as he breaks his base, owing to a high boxing IQ. One of the best attributes in Haney's game is his timing. That same elite jab and full punch arsenal have been used to make opponents who become lax with their base in front of him pay. Norman tends to put himself in positions where he can be timed due to his footwork. Habitual rhythm stepping or rhythm bouncing is a process by which you draw your lead foot back towards your rear foot and out of a boxing stance, and then back forward into stance. From the step back, the gather, and the step back into stance, all can be timed by well-placed punches, which has seen Norman eat a large amount of jabs. Haney will likely time Brian Norman as he shuffles in the range using disengagement traps. A disengagement trap is when a fighter purposefully steps out of range and then waits either for their opponent to step back into range, which if the opponent comes forward with poor footwork or breaks their base, Haney is set to attack. or uses the disengagement to bait offense from too far out. Haney often uses the low lead hand, which presents the unguarded target, the head, as a bait. Combined with the disengagement, this creates an illusion where Devin seems vulnerable and lays a trap for his opponent to attack so he can counter. On the front foot, Brian Norman tends to explode forward with offense. This may be preempted by a front step shuffle. The front step shuffle involves stepping first with the lead foot, then a small hop forward as the rear foot lands and the lead foot trails forward. As you can imagine, it presents a large amount of time where the base is broken. So both the footwork and the offense can be drawn out by the disengagement.
Now, I'm not trying to beat a dead horse, but these clips are full of confident Devin who's sure of himself, who's willing to open up and initiate offense. We don't know if that Devin still exists. You don't, I don't, nobody does from looking from the outside looking in. So yeah, he can apply this and possibly torn Norman's rhythm, but will he? I don't know. And if he does, so what? Only clip you got of Devin actually attacking rhythm steps is with a damn jab. So what the hell is that really going to do in the long run? And in regard to Devin setting up disengagement traps or counterpunching, yeah, he does this, but it's rare that Devin actually sits on his punches when he sets traps. It's common knowledge that Devin often has poor punch mechanics when throwing his rear hand. He doesn't often properly rotate his foot while turning his hips to properly initiate the kinetic chain necessary to deliver hard power shots. Instead, he often lifts the rear leg up as he's throwing the cross and then proceeds to turn the foot before eventually dropping the front foot to load the punch. As a result, he's pushing mostly off the calf rather than the thigh, resulting in a less powerful punch. He sacrifices power for the sake of speed, which in turn can make it more possible for him to land, but it can just as easily make Norman less worried about what's coming towards him. It's a risk-reward situation that may not help Devin in his third weight class, as he's obviously already known for not having heavy hands to begin with.
I think you're a little bit confused. Let's wind the clock back a little bit. You said, what's a jab gonna do? Remember, you're the same person talking about eat and shoot counters. So, I mean, this guy can't defend a jab. Let's be real here. Let's move past that. I'll let you get away with that. In regards to the disengagement traps and the long spiel you had about the biomechanics and the kinetic chain, blah, 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 it doesn't take a hard punch to get a flash knockdown. And when you're coming forward with this little care for your footwork, as Brian Norman does with the shuffles and whatnot, or if you're, rhythm stepping, whatever, it doesn't take a powerful punch when someone's off balance. It's all about timing the opponent. Flash knockdowns are a thing, and Brian is just so lackadaisical with his footwork. I'm sure you saw, you don't really want to talk about it. That's cool, but that's not going to be a good thing against Devin Haney, and you're going to see.
In the instances where the fight takes place in the pocket, Norman will likely be able to abuse Haney's very limited skill at this range. Norman possesses an educated inside game composed of frames, posts, and head control to prevent him from throwing punches while concurrently creating space to establish his own. He also uses rear foot shuffles to take angles and attack from advantageous positioning. If his opponents try to hold or smother, Norman is physical enough to deny or break clinches through shoulder and neck frames. When in the clinch, he likes to either turn or push his opponents towards the ropes, taking away real estate and limiting mobility until the ref resets the action. If all else fails, he's more than willing to stand in equal positioning and use his exceptional hand speed and punching power to win most 50-50 exchanges. On the other hand, Haney has little to no control game in the pocket. The little he knows is focused on ending or preventing inside exchanges through duck, smothers, and holding. While he has had success with this in the past, he's also been denied from clinching from far less skilled and physically strong fighters. He makes this a bit easier at times when he tries to smother from a high guard, as the high guard prevents Haney from fully smothering. The space between you and your opponent that your gloves occupy can be enough for them to push you off or shorten their shots to get punches through. When hurt, he tends to weather the storm in an inactive high guard. Being exposed to the same openings every high guard practitioner suffers from, these are typically around the flanks or straight through the shields. This is by far the most favorable range for Norman to dominate Devin. Norman will likely attack Haney's tendency to move back in straight lines. Not only is Norman very aggressive in pursuit, but he's also very explosive and capable of closing distance incredibly fast on his opponent while throwing combinations such as the 2-1 or 1-2-1. In most instances, needing an additional step back to leave punch range is considered moving back linearly, as it typically results in Haney being either near or on the ropes while staying on the line of attack. With Norman being incredibly quick when closing distance, one step back can be just as dangerous. What's more is if he's moving back from mid-range while already located near the ropes. As a result, it limits his defensive options while possibly creating the perception of him losing control during the fight. In the instances where the fight takes place in the pocket, Norman will likely be able to abuse Haney's very limited skill at this range. Norman possesses an educated inside game composed of frames, posts, and head control to prevent him from throwing punches while concurrently creating space to establish his own. He also uses rear foot shuffles to take angles and attack from advantageous positioning. If his opponents try to hold or smother, Norman is physical enough to deny or break clinches through shoulder and neck frames. When in the clinch, he likes to either turn or push his opponents towards the ropes, taking away real estate and limiting mobility until the ref resets the action. If all else fails, he's more than willing to stand in equal positioning and use his exceptional hand speed and punching power to win most 50-50 exchanges. On the other hand, Haney has little to no control game in the pocket. The little he knows is focused on ending or preventing inside exchanges through duck, smothers, and holding. While he has had success with this in the past, he's also been denied from clinching from far less skilled and physically strong fighters. He makes this a bit easier at times when he tries to smother from a high guard, as the high guard prevents Haney from fully smothering. The space between you and your opponent that your gloves occupy can be enough for them to push you off or shorten their shots to get punches through. When hurt, he tends to weather the storm in an inactive high guard. Being exposed to the same openings every high guard practitioner suffers from, these are typically around the flanks or straight through the shields. This is by far the most favorable range for Norman to dominate Devin.
While you are correct that Devin Haney can at times move back in straight lines, it's far from his only means of traversing the ring. Haney is known to disengage with C-steps instead of moving straight back, which would keep him off the line of attack and help him to avoid Norman's explosive pressure. But let's also be a little realistic here. The most effective tactic Haney has that can shut down Norman's explosiveness coming forward is ducking and smother, which we both know Haney does very often. With Norman leaving his base so often, he constantly smothers himself, even in the very clips you have shown. That makes it even easier to pull off. So for this to actually work, we have to assume Devin won't duck and smother and that Norman has gotten a rein on his habit of smothering himself. Sure, on film, he hasn't done it since the Randall fight, but let's look at the man's opposition. Randall was the last, you could say, slick outside fighter he fought. Boca Chica and Cuevas were both boxer punchers coming forward or standing mid-range of Norman for the most part. Santillan was a pure pressure fighter in Sasaki's ass. Stylistically, the last fighter similar to Devin Haney, we saw Norman's explosive pressure have him falling into countless clinch after clinch after clinch after clinch. So how successful are those explosive 1-2-1s and the like gonna be? I'd say not very.
Now, while Haney is capable of other methods of disengagement, he doesn't necessarily stray away from straight lines as the fight proceeds. In the fight against Ryan, most of the clips of Devin getting caught when backing out in straight lines were in the latter half of the fight. Now, sure, you could say, oh, well, at that point he was hurt. So that simply means his instinct when hurt is to back out in straight lines, which keeps him on the line of attack when a fighter who closes distance extremely fast, which only makes him more likely to still get hit as he's stepping out of range, which can result in a brutal stoppage with no Harvey Dock to save him. So yeah, you could say, oh, he also ducks and smothers, but he's not always consistent and properly ducking and smothering, once again shown in the Ryan Garcia fight, as he at times ducks and smothers in a high guard, which is easier to break out of as it doesn't fully smother his opponent. So as a result, all Norman has to do is shorten his shots in the inside when Haney is in there, and as a result, he can still catch him in between. And if he constantly ducks and smothers and holds, there's a risk of him constantly getting warned by the ref and eventually losing the point, which may stray him away from using it in the first place. In that case, we may see more straight lines. So the duck and smother, yeah, it's another method of disengagement, but it's not a open and shut case for Devin either. While that straight lines issue, it's something that can happen in the first half, let alone the second half, and especially if he gets hurt. So, I mean, I would say it's very relevant.
Devin regularly utilizes the clinch to shut down engagements and or return to favorable ring positioning once the fight gets to a range where he's uncomfortable with, as has been mentioned in passing throughout the study, which will likely lead to Norman getting shut down in his best positions. Devin often enters the clinch from a duck and smother, which lowers the center of gravity as he pushes forward into the hold. With that lowered center of gravity, Devin often forces his opponent off balance as he initiates the clinch. The lower positioning also makes it easier for Devin to get an underhook on his opponent. With that underhook, Devin can also use the leverage on that side to turn his opponents towards the ropes. An underhook comes from wrestling. It's when you put your arm under your opponent's arm to gain leverage. In wrestling, it helps to set up takedowns. In a boxing clinch, where takedowns aren't a threat, the underhook is used to control and steer your opponent. Because it gives you positional control, getting at least one underhook is often essential in clinch fighting. Devin also isn't completely inactive in the clinch, either working with a free hand to land offense or using physicality to create space and land. When Norman gets an underhook, he usually begins to push his man to the ropes, free his arms, and make space on the inside to begin his offense. But transitioning from underhook into punches isn't as simple as it seems. The underhook may dissuade the opponent from throwing meaningful punches on that side, but what it does give the opponent access to is the inverse control known as an overhook. So releasing the underhook means that you must contend with and break the overhook first. But freeing your own control also means freeing the opponents and giving them space as well. So without immediately attacking after creating said space, you've only created an opportunity for your opponent to either attack or, in Haney's case, re-establish control. This is a reoccurring story for Norman in the clinch. Not even to mention the times in the clinch where Norman becomes lackadaisical and doesn't even attempt to fight out of it, simply waiting for the ref to break the action. Without efficiently being able to mount offense from or break the clinch, the position will likely only favor Haney.
While I do see Devin effectively clinching at times to stop Norman's offense, he hardly ever initiates offense. Sure, he did it a few times against Jojo Diaz and Cambosos, but more often than not, he didn't. In the fight against Ryan, when he tried to initiate offense in the pocket, he got put on his ass. While he does use the duck and smother, he doesn't always do this effectively. And while you showed Norman having trouble transitioning from an underhook to offense, you failed to show Devin taking advantage of this when he was in the same position, taking advantage of the free space when breaking the control. So at most, what Devin will likely do is make it difficult for Norman to initiate offense at times in the clinch when he uses underhooks. That only benefits Devin under the assumption that he's successfully winning the round. If he's not, it can be perceived as him trying to hold, which can be warned for if he does it too frequently throughout the fight like he did against Linares.
The issue is, this is pretty simple. If I've shown you Norman having problems transitioning into offense against fighters who aren't proficient clinchers like Devin Haney, then what are we even discussing here? If he can't transition into offense, the position favors Devin Haney. Until the ref resets, Devin's gonna probably turn Buddy so he can get back to center ring, and your guy's gonna rock it and leap and lunge and jump right back into another clinch, turn him, ref's gonna separate, and it's gonna happen over and over and over again. The clinch, it's not a position that Norman is favored in, and it's a position he's going to find himself in over and over and over and over again whenever Devin decides, I'd rather not be in this position right now. It's really bad for your fighter when Haney's going to be able to shut him down constantly because he can't fight out of the clinch. That's what's going to happen, and that's what the film shows.
Norman will likely have success cutting off the ring if Devin chooses to heavily rely on lateral movement. He's shown to possess fundamental footwork when cutting off escape routes in order to force engagements in restricted spaces. Left foot moves going left, right foot moves first going right. In Haney's most recent outing, he used lateral movement for the vast majority of the fight. When Haney would stop moving left or right, he would often pendulum bounce in one position while remaining out of a boxing stance. As a result, Haney remained very mobile as his opponent mostly struggled to land many clean punches. However, the drawback was that he hardly ever threw punches when in this position, even a jab. What's more is that as often as Haney used lateral movement, he sparingly used lateral traps which would allow him to set his feet before his opponent and attack while their feet were momentarily off balance. For the most part, he typically only threw punches when both him and his opponent's feet were set, or when employing linear disengagement traps while moving straight back. Unlike Haney's last opponent, Jose Ramirez, Brian Norman Jr. isn't a declining fighter who's unwilling to let his hands go on an elusive target. Even if he's unable to land cleanly, ineffective aggression is typically favored over pure defense. Defensive responsibility with no return fire, while your opponent is throwing punches over long stretches, runs the risk of the judges assuming you're not comfortable and being outworked, thus losing the round. Constantly avoiding engagements isn't indicative of being the superior boxer, but it can suggest you're not in control.
He's not backing up exactly, he's just constantly moving laterally, making it impossible for Ramirez to throw a meaningful punch, while at the same time, he's mostly not throwing meaningful punches either. Every once in a while, a lead left hook will land. Sometimes a combination, but by and large, Devin Haney hasn't shown much of his skills here tonight.
So you may wonder why I didn't bring up lateral movement in this film study. And truth be told, I don't view lateral movement and lateral traps as a huge key to victory for Devin. I've shown how outside to mid-range, Devin is simply the better fighter and is poised to dominate in those ranges and shut down Norman at his best range. I'm glad you only mentioned lineal disengagement traps in passing, probably because you know how catastrophic they are for your fighter, but I digress. Let's entertain this for a second. Let's talk about lateral movement a little bit, shall we? There's another concept I want to introduce you to, Joey. I know I've been schooling you for a little bit now, but we're almost done, so pay a little bit more attention. Explosive pressure versus methodic pressure. A fighter who pressures someone and tries to cut off the ring, but just can't help themselves from exploding into their offense and leaving their base, versus a fighter who hawks their opponent down with methodical front foot pressure and traps them against the ropes. Which describes Brian Norman Jr.? Do I need to answer every leaping hook, leaping jab, and so on and so on and so on just represents Norman losing contain, an easy opportunity for Devin to turn out while Norman rockets forward. This is a concept we've spoken on in numerous film studies. Without intelligent front foot pressure to position Haney, Norman can't hope to cut off the ring. Not even to mention seemingly meaningless rhythm bounces give his out ample time to leave the scene. And he does it so habitually and loses contain doing it so many times. It's not even funny. Even when he does trap his opponent to the ropes, he often gives up contain on purpose. Make it make sense, my guy. I don't think Haney even needs lateral movement to win, but thank you, because now I just showed if he uses it, Norman still can't do shit about it. Your boy ain't even the ring cutter you're making him out to be. You ended this debate on another flop. Please try a little bit harder next time.
Ah, Jake. See, you've been missing the whole big picture. I've said it so many times, and yet it doesn't just click into your head yet. The fact of the matter is, we don't know what Devin Haney's gonna come in to the fight. We don't know if Devin Haney is gonna be the same mid-range to outside fighter we know. He wasn't that in his last fight, and he wasn't as successful doing it in the fight before then. You could say, oh, well, for 30 plus fights, he was successful with it. Well, for the last two, his most recent, he wasn't. And that's where this all stems from. Because for some reason, he decided to use a bunch of lateral movement his last fight. And at the end of the day, we know what sport this is. This is boxing, the sweet science, the art of hitting and not getting hit. But that shit that Devin showed in his last fight, That wasn't it. That was barely hitting and not wanting to get hit. Just excessive lateral movement with little to no lateral thrust behind it. The scoring criteria for boxing is based on effective aggression, ring generalship, and hard and clean punches. The only time when coming forward is good in reference to that criteria is if the op is fighting negative, which Haney did all night against Ramirez with very minimal offense. The use of lateral movement for the sake of disengaging ain't boxing. You got one man trying to initiate a fight while you got the other one avoiding a fight. We've seen fighters get the short end of the stick in numerous fights in boxing history, past and present, for overutilizing lateral movement without consistent offense. Canelo Skull, Viterbi Bivol 1, Foster Conceição, and most famously, De La Hoya Trinidad. As proven with these fights, being the A side ain't enough if you aren't fighting back. So while Haney may likely avoid getting knocked out as he puts on his best Usain Bolt impression and runs the whole damn night, he'll likely lose several rounds if Norman is constantly chasing him around while initiating offense while Haney is mostly moving laterally. It doesn't matter if he doesn't properly cut off the ring if Haney isn't throwing punches in the process. If he's initiating, he's going to win off the round anyway. He'll likely lose the round if Norman's constantly chasing him with offense while Haney's moving laterally, throwing punches sparingly. It's the strongest path to Norman winning by decision. While Dev is a very skilled boxer with a high boxing IQ, there's just no way of knowing which Dev is going to show up on fight night. Is he going to be the confident Devin Haney that dominated the likes of Linares, Gamboa, Cambosos, and Prograis behind an elite jab? Or is he going to be the guy that seemed less confident letting his hands go in his last two fights? And if he is the same old Devin, is he going to fix his mistakes when throwing the jab or risk getting caught in between punches like he did with Ryan and end up badly hurt again? How is he going to respond if or when he gets caught by a full-fledged welterweight with power in both hands? Is he going to be on his bike and try to win the fight by moving around and getting outworked? Once again, everything depends on Devin's game plan and his confidence letting his hands go. And without knowing how he's going to look in sparring or training camp, I can't make that assumption. Nobody can. I can make the assumption that if Devin doesn't fix the holes within his jab, or if he makes another roadrunner impression, he's going to lose by either decision or brutal knockout. Whichever decision he makes on November 22nd, Brian Norman Jr. will be Devin the Dream Haney's biggest nightmare.
Brian Norman Jr., he's a good fighter, but, he's stepping up to a level that he's never been at before. Devin Haney is a fighter that's fought for undisputed. He's a two-division champion. He's done it under the bright lights. Is Brian Norman? We can't say so. Brian Norman simply hasn't fought at this level before, and with the mistakes he's shown at a lower level, being the jab eater versus Quentin Randall, the only opponent that we can really compare to Devin Haney, I'm not convinced that he's going to rise to this occasion. And with his father in his corner, the one making his game plans, arguing in the comments section, showing his enlightened boxing knowledge, I'm not sure that he'll even come with a game plan that can properly take advantage of Devin Haney's mistakes. You keep saying, will we see the old Devin? I'm wondering if we're going to see the same Brian Norman, because if we see the same Brian Norman, the jab eater, it's just going to be a long ass night for dude. So on November 22nd, I think what we all know really is going to happen. It's going to happen. Brian Norman is going to get a 12-round UD loss to Devin the Dream Haney.
Fight fam. Boxing is called the sweet science for a reason. Every slip, every counter, every trap, it's all hidden in the details. At Boxing Gems, we break down those details frame by frame so fans can see the art behind the fight. If you enjoy our YouTube film studies and want to go deeper down the rabbit hole, Patreon is the place. It helps us keep producing high quality breakdowns without worrying about algorithms, and it gives you exclusive access to the content that can't make it on the YouTube. Get extended live stream breakdowns with more detail and analysis. Ask your own questions in the 24/7 chats, decide what fights or fighters we cover, and get personalized private analysis. Gain access to our thriving betting community as well as Boxing Gems weekly picks and much more. Your support means we can keep studying the sport we love and showing why boxing is the most beautiful science. Join the Boxing Gems community on Patreon and let's keep breaking down the fight game together. This is Ryan, professional boxing analyst and founder of Boxing Gems Film Study. Film don't lie.